Go ahead, Gonzalo, whenever you're ready. Well, thank you all very much. As always, it's a pleasure to be with you for another Thursday. Today is the 9th session. Then we would have 2 left. And well, we are going to talk about human relationships, right? How they are different, right? If they're based on the ego, as they have been until now. The transition to doing them from love, right? And well, the first thing we have to say, I believe, is that it is evident that human relationships in the history of humanity, well, have left much to be desired, right? Humanity until now, as we all know, full of wars. We have borders, countries control, a mess of administrative matters, properties, I don't know what, and all that is because there is no possibility, right?
Do you have
Those with, let's say, low or medium consciousness can't easily reach agreements, right? And also about respect, right? And also decisions and positions are often taken based on false beliefs, aren't they? And it's true that we always believe we are in possession of the truth when we take certain positions or opinions on things, right? If you remember in the session about levels of consciousness, we talked about how we saw how in the second level of consciousness, which was the lowest, right, of those we presented, reaching agreements was impossible because it was the law of the strongest. And we said that 70% of humanity, which is at level 3 more or less, right? Well, precisely the lesson the soul has to learn, isn't it? Is that ability to reach agreements, to commit to them, right? And to fulfill them, right? Even modifying them from time to time by mutual agreement, right? When circumstances change and when necessary to modify them, right? But as we continuously see in politics, on television, in the news, everywhere, this ability to reach agreements and to respect them, well, is not truly consolidated in the 2 levels of consciousness.
Lower ones, right? Where
95% of humanity is there. Now, remember that we talked about 25% of humanity at level 2 and about 70% at level 3, right? Therefore, it is not surprising that human relationships have not worked with. In the thousands of years, we have already existed as a human race, right? And we see it in the year 2022, right? With the war in Ukraine and Russia and other places that are also at war, and that this doesn't end, right? So I think the first thing we have to remember, right? Or ask ourselves, right? In these sessions, what is the true purpose, right? Of the existence of human relationships? Why has God made things this way? And why do we have to interact, right? We had already said that, well, one cannot grow for others, but neither can one grow without others, right? And we need each other, well, to learn how to relate harmoniously, right? Which is one of the great subjects that the soul has to learn in its evolution, right? So let's say that human relationships, in my opinion, they fundamentally have 2 purposes, right? And this is what we must keep in mind when we interact with any person, whether it's a couple relationship, a family relationship, social, or simply a human relationship, right? And the first purpose is that we are here to learn to live harmoniously with all living beings in the universe, right? Not only with the human race, animals must also be treated differently, and other beings that exist in the universe as well, right? So the purpose of relationships is precisely for souls to learn to live in harmony. Because if you pay close attention, harmonious coexistence always results in an increase in vital energy, right?
And any rise in vital energy, increases our inner peace and makes contemplative activity easier, right? Because there is less interference from internal conflict, no? And also the second purpose of relationships should be seen from love, of course, not from the ego, is mutual help, right? That we can all provide each other in our spiritual growth, you see? So the first purpose would be to learn to live harmoniously. And the second purpose is to help each other in our spiritual growth, which is why we are here. Since we have seen in these sessions that this is a school for souls, and therefore we come to learn that, right? Let's see. The serious problem we have in human relationships is that reactivity, right? Incessant, that happens between us, and that causes us an immediate loss of peace, right? If you remember the example we gave in a previous session, but it's good to repeat it here, right? It's that we human beings wouldn't leave our financial resources or our health in the hands of ignorant people, right? We would look for good managers or good doctors, right? However, when a person does something that our ego doesn't like or confronts us or whatever, we immediately lose our peace, right? And so we are not willing to leave our less important assets, such as health and economic resources, in the hands of ignorant people. But we are willing, without realizing it, to leave our peace continually in the hands of ignorant people, right? And that is something we have to take responsibility for, because if I think that if we examine ourselves, well, that happens to all of us, right? In some way, right? And we have to be aware of that problem, right? That non-reactivity is necessary for inner peace, and that we have to protect our inner peace even more, right? Than what we protect with our reactivity, our financial resources, and our health, right? And that's why we have to know that human beings can relate, right, to others from 3 different operational centers. That's what we have to be aware of, isn't it? On one hand, as we are physical beings, we have instinct, right? And instinct leads us or provokes us to flee or fight, right? And so whenever we are relating from instinct, well, fundamentally, we are relating like animals do, right? Like how a tiger well takes care of its babies, looks after its own, but it eats all the others, you see? It defends its territory. In other words, when we relate from instinct, which we can call natural behavior, right? That happens a lot at the lower levels of consciousness, right? Because that's where they operate from. And therefore, we cannot rely on instinct. Instinct is not made to achieve harmonious relationships, right? Instinct fights, flees, protects territories, reproduces, but it does not create harmonious relationships, right? And we need to be clear about that, right? When we advance, right, in the level of consciousness, then we establish relationships from what I would call behavior learned, right? And well, essentially from the ego, right? From emotionality, the mind, our ideas, our beliefs, and our feelings, right? And we can call that learned behavior to distinguish it from natural behavior, right? Which comes from instinct, right? But when we form relationships from learned behavior or from the ego, we also do not get good results in relationships, because then we use verbal violence, the imposition of the ego, I am right, you are not, and so on. Of course, it is a better behavior than instinctive behavior, but it is still insufficient, right, to achieve harmonious human relationship. And therefore, the proposal of this talk is that we try to develop our human relationships not from natural or instinctive behavior, not from learned cultural or egoic behavior, but from conscious behaviors. That is from the soul, right? But of course, to be able to relate from the soul, we must always be very aware of the purpose of relationships. That is, we have human relationships to obtain or to serve, right? That's the question we have to ask ourselves. Okay? Of course, yes, if we are capable of of elevating the internal operational center, right? When it comes to interacting, we would do so from the soul, not from the ego, learned behavior, or not from instinct, natural behavior. And it's the only way we can achieve harmonious relationships, right? Because if you notice, there are many physical differences between people, that's evident, right? But there are still more mental differences than physical ones, okay? Therefore, from separation and from difference, we will never find harmonious relationships, but from a common purpose of spiritual understanding that we are all brothers, we are souls, we are children of God. We are all there growing, and we all have to make mistakes to grow. Therefore, we have to be more tolerant, right, with the mistakes of others and not take it personally, because that's when reactivity, defense, and disharmony occur in the relationship, right? Having said that, we have also said that love is not foolish, right? And that neither love nor God, no one forces us to live, right, with people who are different from us in terms of level of consciousness, okay? However, the fact that we are not obligated to live together does not mean that we are not obligated to respect one another. They are two different things, okay? For example, angels do not live with us, right? Okay. I think I gave the example in another talk, right? That love is not idiotic by saying, I love my granddaughter. I also love crocodiles because they are God's creations and they should be respected, right? Like all living beings in the universe, in their habitat, to have their experiences. But I don't put them together in a room, because if I put them together in a room, the crocodile will bite my granddaughter. So love leads me to give each person or each being their space, to respect everyone, but do not force people or beings who are on very different levels of consciousness to live together, because then that does not help the spiritual growth of both, does it? So that's why we had said, if you remember in previous sessions, that the tool of love, right, in those situations is setting boundaries. Right? Setting boundaries in love means I do not live with people who are not on my level of consciousness, but I am willing to serve and respect them. See, I mean, if we could be of service, we would be. Could we perhaps be of service to Pablo Escobar or Al Capone on some occasion? Well, we would be, but we don't live with them, right? So that idea of loving boundaries must be very clear so that we can maintain peace, because sometimes we set boundaries, but we do so with guilt, okay? So when it is necessary to set boundaries, you set them, but you set them with love and without guilt. Another important idea, I think, is that we'll see, when we have human relationships, we need to learn to make that boundary properly, right? Because if we set boundaries with someone before we have achieved, that person's behavior should not take away our peace. We are not setting boundaries correctly, right? Before setting boundaries, we must undergo an internal process so that the person or people in question with whom we are going to set boundaries no longer disturb our peace. And when they no longer disturb our peace, that is when we can set boundaries lovingly. Because if we establish boundaries before achieving peace, that situation will very likely repeat in our lives, because it's a lesson we haven't learned, right? The fact that a person has bad behavior, bad attitudes, low level of consciousness, that's a matter between them and God. We have to learn not to let any of that disturb our peace. Okay, so I insist, if something takes away our peace, it's because we haven't done enough internal work to understand that nothing outside of us can take away our peace. That's the idea. I mean, No, I mean, no one can make us feel bad without our permission. You see, if we use the tools of spiritual understanding and respect, we can realize that this person has every right and all the freedom that God has given them to make mistakes, to do things wrong in our judgment, to do whatever. But if something takes away our peace, that's our problem, not the other person's. I mean, nobody can hurt our feelings, nor can we hurt the other's feelings, right? Because I harm myself and the other harms themselves with the judgment or opinion they have formed about the situation they know. Okay? So if we want to relate with love, we have to learn to set boundaries with love. But having first done the work so that the behavior of the people we are setting boundaries with does not disturb our peace, no matter how many mistakes they are making. Because if it takes away our peace, the problem is ours. It means that there are still things, whatever they may be, that can take away our peace. Okay? And what we need to try to achieve is that nothing external can take away our peace. Okay? So then you will see that relationships, when they are destined, are not harmonious, right? There is always resistance, always ego imposing, and always a lack of harmony. Only conscious relationships are no longer of destiny, but rather where work is done, right? Understanding, respect, mutual growth, and service. Therefore, when a relationship is taking away our peace, that indicates it is a relationship of destiny for us. And what we have to do is work within ourselves, so it no longer takes away our peace using spiritual understanding. When we have harmonious relationships, satisfying relationships, relationships that increase our vital energy, then we know we are in a conscious relationship, not a destined relationship, right? And that is important to keep in mind. So to be able to create conscious relationships and not relationships of destiny, I would like to offer you 9 or 10 ideas that we can put into practice, okay? Without elaborating too much on them, because they are self-explanatory, right? The first idea I would like to present to you in this regard is to have harmonious relationship. Or more harmonious, we should try to avoid the conceptual interpretation that we are always making about the intentions, attitudes, and behaviors of others. Okay? So I would like to give you a silly example in this, right? But imagine this situation. A man is driving on the road and suddenly another comes from behind and overtakes him at full speed and, well, almost crashes into him and is going at an unusual speed. And then we get angry and say he's crazy and whatnot. Well, and that man continues on his way and suddenly arrives at his house. And his wife runs out to greet him and says, "Hey, you won't believe the luck we've had, because our son was choking on a bone from something he ate. And the surgeon arrived just in time, was able to perform the tracheotomy and saved him." But the initial interpretation we were making is, that guy is crazy. He almost caused a traffic accident. He just messed things up for me. Okay? So we have to stop making so many conceptual interpretations of others' intentions, attitudes, and behaviors. If we do not do that, it will be difficult for us to develop, to habitually achieve relationships of love and not of ego, right? Good. The second thing we can do in relationships, right, is manage our expectations, right? There's a saying that goes, where you have an expectation, you will have a disappointment, right? And we always have expectations, right? About how others should behave, what they should or shouldn't do, what they should do for us. If we've done a lot for them,
and they've done little for us, etc., etc. We always fill ourselves with expectations, don't we? We expect the president of the government to do well, right? We expect our partner or whoever it may be, our children, to respect and love us. For others, to behave in a way that seems right to us. Whenever we have an expectation, we are in some way putting harmonious relationships at risk, okay? And we need to lower our level of expectation, you see? Because in relationships of love, they are relationships of service and respect. And what we need to focus on is what we are going to give, not so much on what we are going to receive, right? What we receive, we will receive from God, and it will be much more than what anyone else can give us, you know? Therefore, as a second idea, we need to learn to manage expectations. You see, the third idea, which we've already explained at the beginning of the talk, but it's good to bring it up as the third idea, is that we need to learn to set boundaries with love, right? I won't expand on this because we've already covered it at the start of the session. If we don't learn to set boundaries, we won't have harmonious relationships either, because it's not possible to have an intimate relationship between incompatible beings, right? And therefore, loving boundaries are the solution to that problem, okay? The fourth idea we need to keep very much in mind, you know, for, how should I put it? For harmonious or loving relationships, not ego-driven ones, is that we need to make ourselves trustworthy to others, okay? And we need to understand that to be trustworthy, among many other things, we need to have our emotional body and our sentimental body in balance. Because if someone comes to us, for example, to confess or tell us they've made a mistake, right? A mistake that might affect us, if our emotional and sentimental bodies are not in balance, we might react badly and lose control, you know? Getting angry, and if we do that, it will be very difficult for that person to come talk to us a second time, right? Because what that person wants is peace, right? And not a negative emotional reaction from us, you see? So it's very hard. In other words, to be trustworthy, it's not enough to just be honest, right? Someone might think, I'm trustworthy because if you leave me a 20-euro bill, I'll return it untouched. But honesty alone isn't enough. To be trustworthy, it's necessary to have our emotional and sentimental bodies in balance. You get me? Besides honesty, to be trustworthy to others, right? So the fifth idea for having harmonious relationships based on love and not ego is that we need to learn to let go of the three levels of aggression and violence that we all carry inside, right? Obviously, the most obvious violence is physical, right? And I take it for granted that everyone in this talk has already overcome that, right? But I'm not sure to what extent we've all overcome our capacity for verbal violence. You know, of course, I can't say with certainty to what extent we have managed to overcome our capacity for mental violence. Is that clear? So, as we said in another session, when we judge someone, it seems like nothing happens, right? Because we're not being physically violent and we're not expressing it either. So it goes unnoticed and we think it doesn't have any impact. But damage caused by mental violence is very strong, right? Both for us and for others. When we talked about managing thoughts, we said that a thought is a thing, right? Like a chair or a table, and also a thing that affects other things, right? So the energy that mental violence gives off does affect those outside of us, right? Therefore, it's something we need to be mindful of, because even if we're controlled in physical violence and verbal violence, sometimes we're not aware that we're not as controlled in mental violence, you know?
And then we see an opposition politician on television, and we think what we think about him, right? Or we see someone making mistakes, and we form an opinion, don't we? And what we think affects us and others, right? That's why people who have already reached a higher level of consciousness, who are interested in spiritual growth, must pay special attention to the level of mental violence they still carry inside. Because the other forms of violence we have already worked on more or less, but the mental one, sometimes it gets out of control, right? And that one must be kept in mind. Well, let's move on to another idea. I think this is the sixth one. To maintain harmonious relationships, it is essential to always be aware of the purpose. That is, as we said at the beginning, what is my purpose in establishing relationships? It's not just about seeking contacts to improve professionally or finding a partner just to feel better, to share, or to enjoy certain aspects of life. The question is, what is our real purpose? Before starting any relationship, we must ask ourselves what our purpose is. Because if it's not to serve or grow together, from the beginning, we are creating a flawed relationship. We may be looking to get something, distract ourselves, have fun, but if the purpose is not to respect each other and evolve together, the relationship is born on an unstable foundation. So, a trick that I used at the beginning for this is to do something different for ourselves. For example, I don't carry anything in my hands. It really bothers me to wear anything. A ring, a bracelet, it annoys me a lot, you know, since I never carry anything, but I decided to wear a red string on my wrist for 2 months, okay? It reminded me to stay focused, because once we understand these ideas and are on this path of spiritual growth, the problem is that sometimes we lose concentration. And when we lose concentration, we fall back into our old behaviors. You know what I mean? Whether out of habit or instinct. Now, if we can manage to stay focused for 2 months on what the purpose of our actions is, on what the purpose in our relationships is, those 2 months of focus will turn into a habit, all right? And then we won't need any reminders to stay focused, and we'll lose concentration less often. So the advice is to keep your focus on the purpose, right? For example, in my case, I remember even when I was more advanced in my spiritual growth, there were a couple of things that always made me nervous: slow traffic, or playing golf on a slow course, you know? And as a businessman, I tend to be impatient, right? And I noticed clearly that if I was focused, I could handle it perfectly. It didn't upset me or take away my peace. But if I was distracted for whatever reason, and those two little things happened, it would immediately take away my peace and make me impatient. And that's why this technique, or this idea of wearing something that reminds us all day for a couple of months of what our purpose is, so we don't lose focus, works so well, it becomes a habit, and then we don't have a problem for the rest of our lives. Okay? Now, obviously, if we want to have harmonious relationships, we need to develop certain communication skills. Because if our intention is to serve and grow together, well, we have to avoid any kind of aggressiveness in communication. And we also shouldn't talk to people about important topics or things we need to solve or agreements we need to reach when the other person is not in a good energetic state, because that will just lead to worse results. Okay, so for example, to talk with your partner or a good friend It's better to do it well on a Saturday mid-morning, since having set a time to talk, that not on a Thursday night when everyone is already exhausted from working or not working or from the kids or whatever, right? So the choice of the moment, right, when we're going to establish communication with other people is important. And to choose that moment, also, it is good to evaluate not only that we are in a good energetic state, but that they are too, meaning that the communication is neither aggressive nor untimely, right? And that is something we need to learn so that our relationships become more and more harmony. As a seventh, eighth idea, because I've already lost count, it is good for establishing harmonious relationships to let go of false beliefs, right? For example, what is a false belief? Someone can be responsible for how I feel. That is a false belief. It may be perfectly widespread in the culture, but it is a false belief. Another false belief is someone can make me happy. I am tired of going to weddings, for example, and the priest in the homily says to, oh, and you so and so have to make so and so happy, and you so and so have to make so and so happy. Or the marriage has already been taken care of. Well, I'm telling you, well, why? Because Fulanita or Menganito are only going to be happy by themselves and only going to be happy if they raise their level of awareness. But if I believe that my partner has to make me happy when I'm not happy, I'm going to blame them. Am I clear, right? So those are false beliefs. No one can make you happy. No one can hurt your feelings except yourself, right? And either we abandon those false beliefs or we will never have harmonious relationships, because obviously neither our partner nor anyone else will be able to guess at all times what we need to find ourselves happy. I don't know if I'm being clear, right? And they will need to have their space to behave as they are, right? And therefore we have to be clear about what we need for this to work. That our feelings depend on ourselves and our happiness can only be internal, and abandon the false idea that other people can hurt our feelings or that other people can make us happy, right? And it is important to abandon those false beliefs in order to have harmonious and loving relationships, right? Let's proceed. The ninth idea is we need to learn to evaluate, but without judging, okay? This is the problem we find ourselves in, right? Faced with the external, we can fall into relativism, for example, right? Well, not one thing is not better than another. Everything is the same. It depends on the circumstances. It depends on personal taste. That is what is called relativism. There is no objective truth, so to speak, right? But relativism is not the solution because the universe is hierarchical. An angel has a higher level of consciousness than we do. We have a higher level of consciousness than a dog, and a dog has a higher level of consciousness than a plant. In turn, among human beings, a Mother Teresa of Calcutta or a Gandhi has a higher level of consciousness than a normal person, and a normal person has a higher level of consciousness than a criminal, right? So therefore, relativism is not the solution. And then this is a topic that was very difficult for me to resolve in my own spiritual growth, right? Because I would say, man, but then if I don't fall into relativism, I'm judging, right? And the gospel says we cannot judge, among other things, because we do not have all the information to do so, and also because it's not our role. God will do that. So the solution is neither judging nor relativism. The solution is that we learn to evaluate or discern, okay? And the question then is, what is the difference between evaluating and judging? I struggled with this for many years in my life until a spiritual teacher explained it to me and gave me the solution. And since then, I've had it resolved, right? Let's see. So when we evaluate, we are observing that Mother Teresa has a higher level of consciousness than Putin. I mean, that cannot be unobserved. I don't know if I am explaining myself, because if we didn't observe it, we wouldn't know where to work towards, right? Or what or where we are going, right? But when I judge, I am adding my own emotional burden to that evaluation. That is the difference. So when the gospel tells us that we cannot judge, it does not say that we cannot evaluate. What it does tell us is that when we evaluate, we should not add our own emotional burden to that evaluation, right? I can evaluate that Putin has a lower level of consciousness than Mother Teresa, but that doesn't have to lead me to hate Putin. Am I explaining myself? Not to add emotional weight to it. Now, if I stop observing it, I don't know where to work on my spiritual growth, right? So this difference between relativism, evaluation, and judgment is very important to maintain harmonious or loving human relationships, right? And the only solution is to observe what emotional burden of our own we are placing on our evaluations, right? And therefore, yes, keep evaluating, but do not add emotional weight. And that way we don't judge and we fulfill the evangelical teaching. Okay, good. The 10th idea I share with you, is that you cannot build loving relationships from insensitivity, but neither from sensitivity. Loving relationships can only be formed from transensitivity or metasensitivity, or from what has been called, though I don't like the word, in the Christian tradition, holy indifference. Okay? I don't like the word because, yes, it is holy, but there is nothing indifferent about it. In other words, people with low levels of consciousness are insensitive and cannot form loving relationships because they don't care about the feelings or well-being of the other person. For sensitive people, other people's feelings and well-being do matter a lot. But in caring so much, they lose their peace with other people's suffering or difficulties, right? And in losing that peace, their capacity to serve diminishes. Therefore, if we want to have relationships of love and not of ego, we must learn to be transensitive, which is not the same at all as being insensitive. In other words, all people of a very high level of consciousness are transensible, but they are not insensitive. They will do everything in their power to serve others or to alleviate their suffering. But we will not throw ourselves into the pit with them, because then we will not be able to offer a branch to get him out. And moreover, we will lose our peace and we will lose the capacity to serve. This idea of the difference between insensitivity, sensitivity, and transensitivity must be very clear. Do I make myself clear? Because our suffering will not help either us or others. Now, other people's suffering should matter to us in order to try to alleviate it and be of service. But we also must respect their destinies, and therefore know that they also have a Father called God, and that if they are being made to go through that situation, it is an evolutionary and destined situation for them, which obviously makes them suffer, just as our own growth has made us suffer until we have achieved it, right? And therefore, that distinction is very important. All spiritual traditions of the world understand this clearly. As I say, some have called it holy indifference, others call it by another name, but the idea is metasensitivity or transensitivity. That's what we have to strive for. Practice and achieve, right? Service in everything. Now, suffering, no. Do I explain? And that is and from sensitivity, one suffers. And that is the problem with sensitivity, okay? All right. Therefore, to have relationships of love and not ego, we must learn to reach agreements. This would be the 11th idea. Commit to the agreements we've made, keep them, modify them when they need to be modified due to changing circumstances, but by mutual agreement between the two people who made the agreement, right? Agreements are not broken unilaterally, right? Unless it is a matter of force majeure. And therefore, that ability to reach agreements is precisely what we need to do if we want to move to the fourth level of consciousness. But of course, to reach agreements, the first thing we need to do is ensure they are precise agreements, right? For example, imagine that I agreed with a friend of mine. Look, if you do this, I am going to swim to Miami. It is a nonsensical agreement because no one will be able to swim to Miami. It is an agreement impossible to fulfill, right? Therefore, when we make agreements with people, we must learn to reach agreements. And to learn to reach agreements, they have to be possible for both parties, not excessively burdensome. We have to commit to them and we have to maintain them, right? But we cannot ask for impossible agreements because they would be flawed from the start, because they would be impossible to fulfill, right? So that's a topic we need to keep in mind, huh? Another idea for harmonious relationships. Sometimes culture wrongly teaches us what it means to be honest, doesn't it?
Let's see. There's a difference between narrating reality and telling the truth. When am I narrating reality? For example, a person comes in here and I say, wow, you are really ugly. Or you are so badly dressed today. Or you smell bad. Or whatever, right? That's narrating reality. You know, like from my point of view, the person is ugly and smells bad and whatever you want. But that's not telling the truth or expressing the truth. That's narrating reality. Expressing or telling the truth means telling someone anything that can help them, but that doesn't make them feel bad. I mean, in harmonious relationships, we have to be careful not to hurt others' feelings or emotions, right? So this idea that to be honest, you have to say the first thing that comes to mind immediately, because that's not loving and that's not spiritually correct. The spiritually correct thing is to speak the truth. And to tell the truth is to tell someone something that could help them and doesn't make them feel bad, right? We will explain this in more detail in the talk of the second service. But in human relationships, this is important to note, isn't it? Let's be clear in our heads and minds that there is a difference between narrating reality and telling the truth. And there are times when, if we want to maintain harmonious relationships, we cannot narrate reality. We have to tell the truth. What expressing values is encouraging the other person, but narrating the reality when there is negativity involved is not expressing the truth. And that's not being honest, right? Even if culture has taught us so, isn't it? So it's also important that we learn to depersonalize situations, right? In communication with others, when we're trying to build loving relationships and always stay in the present, right? Because of course, how many times do we say, you last year you annoyed me because, I mean, last year is over, you know what I mean? And it's not the present. We can't in some way, let's say, act in the past, and we can't act in the future either. We can only act in the present. And therefore, constantly bringing issues from the past or worries about the future into conversations and economic relations is not going to help us create harmonious relationship, right? In communication, we have to, whenever possible, stay in the present, right? And depersonalize situations, right? Above all, also understand there is a misconception that commitment, right, takes away our freedom. And we find it hard to commit to anything with our partner, with business partners, in business, with co-workers, with anything. Commitment gives us the feeling that it takes away our freedom, and it is quite the opposite. Because everything done without commitment in life does not work. It is not under the universal law. You remember the lesson about universal laws, right? We need to commit with what we do, who we are with, and who we interact with. And it doesn't take away our freedom, it's the opposite. We use our freedom to decide to commit. Because without commitment,
there is no dedication and no results, right? And when we are dealing with toxic people, right? Then, or so-called toxic people, what we need to understand is that the person has the right to be toxic. We cannot take it away from them. They are in their learning process, and we don't know their level of awareness. I've always said the same thing. Young children wouldn't behave like us. They wouldn't let us have a peaceful session, right? But we understand that they are young children and are in the process of growing up. Then when someone is toxic, what we need to do is learn not to let them take away our peace. And if the person continues to be toxic, we need to establish healthy boundaries with kindness, right? Because obviously love doesn't oblige us to live with savages, right? But it does in a way oblige us not to let those savages take away our peace, to wish them the best, and to be willing to help if possible. So when dealing with toxic people, there are two solutions. First, make sure they don't take away our peace. Second, set boundaries. There's no other solution, right? Or let's say those are the solution. From love, all right. And lastly, I'm seeing something in the chat that I was about to mention, but since they're asking, when two people are considering marriage, what advice would I give them before making their decision? Well, look, in a relationship, there needs to be a connection in 4 key aspects: physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual. If one of these aspects is missing, the relationship won't work. Not just the physical body and not just the emotional body, but also the mental and spiritual bodies. So if one of these 4 aspects doesn't function properly, the marriage won't work. It's similar to how the mind can't function if the brain is damaged. If the physical sexual aspect doesn't work, the marriage won't work. If the sexual aspect is strong, if the emotional, mental, and spiritual aspects are weak, the marriage will still fail because physical attraction alone won't sustain it. You see? The fundamental aspect is one thing, and the significant aspect is another, right? So what I recommend to a couple is to evaluate during the dating period the following. Have we reached agreements easily? Have we argued a lot? If you've argued a lot during the dating period, if you haven't reached agreements easily, if you fought over everything, no matter how attractive the person is to you or how much fun you have with them, don't get married. That would be my recommendation. Precisely. The dating period is there to evaluate that first. If the person is attractive to us and the sexual relationship is satisfying, right? Second, if the emotional, mental, and spiritual connection is balanced, meaning there is emotional stability, mutual understanding, and shared values, if we can reach agreements easily, and if we can resolve problems without endless, energy-draining arguments. And third, and most importantly, if there's a spiritual connection, which means a union of life purpose and values, right? If those 4 things work, then get married. And if any of those things don't work, maybe it's better to wait because things won't get better afterward, as we all know, right? All right. And well, I should probably say something else, right? But well, and above all, 2 people shouldn't get married if they don't value the relationship more than their personal preferences, because then it won't work either, right? Either you value the relationship more than personal preferences, or no one can live with anyone, right? And so that would be, another idea for that question, right? All right, well, if it seems good to you, since we've reached the allotted time, I'll end the presentation and open the floor for questions.
Thank you, Gonzalo. This is a topic that affects us all closely, especially when it comes to relationships, right? At first, the chat was quite calm, but it seems like it has livened up a bit now, you know? Yes, yes. So let's see. I'll read some questions from the chat and then one from Delia about the topic of the last session, but I'll leave that one for the end, if that's okay with you. That sounds perfect. All right, here we go. Look, Alejandra says, Gonzalo, we usually don't live with people who have a completely different vibrational frequency, but surely within the same household, one soul is wiser than the other, right? Or one person has more awareness than the other. For example, when you start to know yourself better than your partner, and even so you're happy with them despite that difference in awareness, what happens then? I think what Alejandra is asking is, what happens when two people in a relationship have different levels of awareness, but still remain happy together? In this case, how is that difference managed?
All right, let's dive into it. When I talk about people at different levels of awareness, I'm referring to different blocks of consciousness. A person at level 2 cannot live with someone at level 3. If you remember, when we talked about levels of awareness, we also mentioned that within each block, there are many subdivisions. In level 3, it's not the same to be at the upper extreme as it is to be at the lower one, right? For example, I can assure you that Mother Teresa would never have lived with someone like Pablo Escobar. One is at level 2 and the other at level 4. It simply wouldn't work. She could help him, of course, but they would never coexist. Now, if one person is in the middle range of level 3 and the other is at the upper extreme of the same level, there's a proximity in awareness that allows for harmonious coexistence. Also remember that levels of awareness, as we discussed in session 3, represent the average of multiple areas of personal growth. Just as a student might be better at geography than math or vice versa, the average results would be similar. The same happens when one person is more developed in one area while their partner excels in another, but the overall level balances out. It's quite common in relationships for one of the two to be a bit more advanced in certain areas while the other is more advanced in others. And that's where relationships help us grow, right? Because none of us is perfect. And we're here to evolve together. A partner can support the other in the areas where they're less developed, and vice versa. That's the beauty of a conscious relationship. However, living with someone in a completely different block of consciousness, that's another story. If I lived with someone at level 2, I'd probably need a gun on my nightstand and a bodyguard at the door. Sooner or later, someone would come in the middle of the night to take revenge on that person over some drug-related issue, right? So no, living with someone from a different block of consciousness is neither advisable nor beneficial for spiritual growth. Now, many couples ask me, should I separate? Shouldn't I separate? My answer to these questions is always the same. If there's physical violence, you must leave immediately. It's intolerable. And there cannot there'll be no second chances. Of physical abuse, you must leave because separation is the only option. Why? Because physical violence forces you to defend yourself. And if you're a being of peace, you don't want to live in situations that involve acts of violence. When they ask me, what about verbal violence? My answer is, well, if there's verbal violence, it depends. Verbal aggression will only affect you if you allow it. It doesn't force you to separate immediately. Paradoxically, it trains you so that these kinds of situations don't take away your peace. And although it may seem ironic, when it no longer takes away your peace, that's when you should separate, but not as an emotional reaction, but because you simply no longer need to tolerate that kind of situation. Therefore, that is my opinion on these cases. Now, when a person at the third level of consciousness is married or in a relationship with another person at the same level, that constitutes mutual growth, right? Because at the third level, neither one nor the other is perfect, right? And therefore, there will always be small things to adjust to understand, be patient with, and learn, such as delaying expression or communication until the right moment. In short, all of this leads to spiritual growth and learning. You know, they say only when the blocks, when seen in terms of levels, as I mentioned, right, are different, that things simply cannot work. In that case, mutual growth is not possible. You see? And that is where I believe separation becomes a possibility or even advisable, right? That is indeed convenient for us not to live with them, but not to let them take away our peace. And therefore, as we have said before, the solution of love in these cases is loving boundaries. What does it mean? Wishing them the best, praying for them so that everything goes as well as possible for them, not taking their toxicity personally, and not letting them take away our peace. But for that, we need to have transcended the ego, of course, because otherwise the ego feels offended and everything else falls apart. Therefore, never let toxic people offend us and take away our peace of mind. It's their problem, not ours, okay? But we are not obligated to live with them. Those two ideas are very clear, right? And if we set boundaries before they take away our peace, probably or almost certainly, we will experience something similar again until we can learn that their behavior takes away our peace. Because you already know that, as we have said on other occasions, in spiritual growth, everything that is resisted persists. We needed to learn it. So either we do it now, later, or in another evolutionary experience, in another life, for those who believe in the transmigration of souls, or in purgatory, those who believe in purgatory. But the soul has to learn not to lose peace over anything external to it. That includes natural disasters, toxic people, whatever, the economy, the economic crisis. I mean, nothing outside of us can take away our peace, okay? And if we have right in front of us toxic people, complications, difficult situations, the proof that we need this as a growth experience is that it takes away our peace. We have always said the same in all the talks. Anything that takes away our peace is proof for us that we need that growth experience.
Here is another question from Esther Martin. I will read it as it is. It says, one of the things that often takes away my peace is someone misunderstanding me and feeling hurt by my words or actions. In those cases, I feel awful. And even if there was no ill intention on my part, I end up beating myself up. I keep going back over and over to recall the other person's discomfort, and I condemn myself for it, which ends up making me detest the person because they make me feel guilty. How can I avoid this?
Well, look, the only way to avoid that, and I'm glad you've asked this question, is through spiritual understanding, right? In the same way, no one can hurt our feelings without our permission. And we cannot hurt others' feelings either. If someone gets hurt by something we do or say, whatever it is, with our best intention, well, that's their problem. What are we going to do about it? It's an experience the other person needs to have to grow, because they also need to learn not to hurt themselves with what others do, right? So what I advise in this case is that the question is very well formulated and the situation is very well explained, is that the person who asked the question must learn not to lose their peace because someone else loses theirs. I cannot be the guarantor of peace for others, because each person is as they are and has their own growth experiences. Moreover, none of us are God, so it is impossible for us to be 100% right? All the things we do, that we say, because it's impossible, because otherwise we wouldn't be here growing too, right? Therefore, just like we have to forgive others. We have to forgive ourselves when we make a mistake. I am sure that the person who asked the question makes a big effort not to hurt others' feelings or disrupt their peace or whatever it may be. I am sure, because otherwise they would not have asked the question. But this does not depend only on them. It also depends on the other person. Do I make myself clear? And therefore, well, look, my dear, once we have set our intention, good intention, if we have said something or done something or whatever it may be that has disturbed someone else's peace, then we have to learn not to lose our own. Because also, imagine that the other person has already lost their peace. And what do we gain from the situation by losing ours? Does something positive happen because we also lose our peace? Hey, if we didn't have good intentions, well, we apologize, we understand, and we are prepared to have good intentions for the rest of the time. But if we had good intentions and what we lacked was success, well, dude, the other person needs that experience to grow or it wouldn't have happened. Just like others sometimes do not get it right with us, also with good intentions. And it is not their fault, nor are they responsible for us losing our peace. Well, as Jesus said in the gospel, he said, all my teachings can be summed up in two. You will love God above all things and your neighbor as yourself. Doesn't it? That's what the gospel says. And therefore, these are the two most important teachings. And we are also our neighbor. So in this, as with forgiveness, just as we forgive others, we must forgive ourselves. And no, the person who asks the question will not gain anything, nor will they do the other any favor, nor will they solve any problem by losing their own peace. Do I make myself clear? Therefore, the answer applies to this question as well. We cannot lose peace for anything. If we have made a mistake, we will try to correct it. If it cannot be corrected because the other person does not want to, does not consent or something, then we have to let them have their experience of growth and destiny. And we need to be clear that we cannot cause any problems for someone else if that person is not involved in having that problem. Am I clear? And therefore, let's keep the peace at all times. That's my proposal, right? In the case, and especially in the case where there was good intention. Good intention is always the most important thing of all. What most determines the level of consciousness. Not so much the intellectual correctness or the correctness in acting, it's the good intention. Having a good intention, everything goes well. Let's go quickly, we will learn. We will learn not to say the same thing or do the same thing in another similar situation, whatever. But you are not responsible for the other person's feelings, and the other person is not responsible for yours.
And that needs to be very clear.
Very interesting, Gonzalo. We are not responsible for the feelings of others, nor are they responsible for our feelings. Neither. It is a very clear idea. Keep this idea in mind, because without it, we will not be able to have loving relationships, you see? Because everyone and ourselves get bothered by everything, get hurt by everything, I don't know. It's just that until that stops, there's nothing to be done. And therefore, we have to put forth our best intention, and the other has to learn to forgive our mistakes, just as we learn to forgive the mistakes of others. And that's in the Our Father. Forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors, and the Our Father is the only prayer that I know or remember that was directly taught by Jesus, right? Then it must have something good. We haven't invented the others, right? But this one, so this one is original.
That is the original one.
This is the original, right? So let me explain.
What I propose is to practice it, right? And to know that it is an egoic need. The more egoic we are, the more we act from the ego, and less from the soul, the more susceptible and offendable we become. Because remember the third basic need of the ego that we all have: to be loved, accepted, admired, and admitted by others. So all of this is susceptibility. The I am annoyed that they have, all of that is an egoic issue of the third need of the ego. and we are here to learn to transcend it. Remember that in a previous talk or session, I think it was in the one about self-responsibility, I told you that we must start changing even our language. So instead of saying this bothers me, say I get bothered by this. It's different. I don't know if I make myself clear. Because this bothers me, it puts me in the paradigm of the victim. I'm not able to deal with the external. Now I get upset with this. They put the paradigm of self-responsibility on me. It's clear that I'm the one who gets upset. Not this, but me.
Very well. Very well, Gonzalo. Thank you. Look, Delia Rancaño, a friend from the desert who has vision difficulties and finds it hard to write in the chat, wants to ask a question. So I will pass the word to her to ask the question. Very well. Delia, go ahead. Go ahead, Delia.
Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. And Gonzalo, too. I love this talk, but I had a question about the previous talk, and the question is about this. When you were talking about maintaining peace and about the key to thinking well, yes? The question that arises for me, because I have a very tricky ego, is how can I differentiate when I am really thinking well or just creating a fantasy to please myself? And this way, saving one of these fears you mentioned, the 4 fears of the ego, right? Which is the avoidance.
Perfect, of course.
If you can give me a hint.
Thank you. That's a very good question. Let's see.
Thinking in a fanciful way, right? It's never going to lead us to spiritual growth. There's a spiritual saying that goes, fool anyone you want, but don't fool yourself. You know what I mean, right? Because then we don't grow, right? I believe that neutral thinking is what's going to bring us peace, which is when the fear of facing is a love confrontation. I don't know if I make myself clear. I'm not referring to attacking or anything like that. The fear of facing is when we are afraid to face people or situations that, even in a loving way, right? So when you have to face something in a loving way, well, you have to face it, because love is not foolish. And love does not ask us to be a doormat, if you know what I mean, that everyone steps on. That is not the love that Jesus teaches us. But he does teach us to be respectful and patient, sensible, wise. Remember, right? Everything he said to the apostles when they went to preach, right? And therefore, my advice is, do not lose the objectivity of the evaluation, right? Because that would be deceiving yourself and you would not grow. But do make sure that situation does not take away your peace, even if you have not lost objectivity. We have to learn to see things objectively, but it should not take away our peace. For example, my partner is this way. I don't make up a fairy tale about Prince Charming, and no, it's like that. Now, this doesn't take away my peace. When it doesn't disturb my peace, I will decide whether to keep living with this or not. I don't know if I'm explaining myself, but I face the situation objectively without losing my peace. There's not much of a trick other than that, right? But of course, if we create a fantasy in our heads, and when something is black, we think it's white, so it doesn't bother us whether it's black or blue. I don't know. No, it is what it is. But what it is doesn't take away my peace. And when I have to communicate or face a situation, I will do it lovingly, as we have said, choosing the right moment, where both energies are high, neither being exhausted. I won't use reproach. I won't use aggressive communication. I will use constructive communication. I will lay all the tools of love on the table to resolve and confront the situation and reach an agreement. Isn't it possible? It's not possible, but it shouldn't take away my peace. And if it's impossible to reach harmonious agreements continually, then that relationship must be ended.
But it shouldn't take my life away.
But not with stories, because then we don't grow, because indeed we don't face what we have to face. And since fear is the opposite of love, well, we have to live without fear. And the fear of confrontation is one of the...
There aren't many more tricks, you know, it's just, well,
Do it as best as possible. Being able to provide the evidence.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Gonzalo. Look, lastly, there is a person who asked if you could provide us with a reading list of mystics to delve deeper into these topics that you are presenting to me. Yes.
Yes, of course, mystical reading, right?
Yes, exactly, especially those that have
Yes, of
impacted your
course.
life.
Of course, yes, look, I will do the following. I will take note immediately, and what I'm going to do are two things. One, I'm going to email them to you so you can distribute them, and I'm going to mention them in the next session. These two things.
I will send them, since we are sending a reminder email about the talk, I would include it there too. Yes, very
Perfect.
good. Perfect. Very good,
pleasure.
Gonzalo. Well, we are close to the end of these sessions, of these talks. Next Thursday, we will explore very interesting topics. We will have a session on abundance and unconditional love, delving into their meaning and application. Very good. There is also something I want to remind everyone that we also have Gonzalo's books to review and to delve deeper into all these matters. And of course, we also have all the recorded talks too. For those who want to listen to them again, you can even share them with family and friends, the link so they can follow Gonzalo's talks. And well, Gonzalo.
Many thanks to all of you, and see you next Thursday.
Yaman, thank you very much.
See you next week.